Did Saitama just turn Genos' character arc upside down by defeating the Mad Cyborg before Genos can get his hands on him? That's the interesting question that Saitama himself brought up in chapter 186 of the manga. The Mad Cyborg was brought up in the main storyline for the first time in years now, and this is when Saitama wonders if Genos ever considered the possibility that the Mad Cyborg has already been defeated. Genos highly doubts this because he hasn't seen a single report of a hero defeating a cyborg of that strength in all the time that the Hero Association has existed. Well, this is when Saitama brings up the aforementioned question. Well, what if I'm the one that defeated the Mad Cyborg? And while Genos doesn't deny the fact that Saitama is capable of this, he argues that Saitama would have at least remembered fighting the Mad Cyborg, seeing as how it was so powerful. I always thought this was a very interesting line for one to add, and it certainly led to a portion of the community arguing that this might actually end up being the case, that this is actually one foreshadowing the end of the Genos and Mad Cyborg arc, because you know, why else would he bring it up? That's kind of the argument. And although I'm not here to argue whether or not that would be a good ending to that whole storyline, what I am here to do is play devil's advocate and kind of lay out the groundwork for how this could possibly make sense within the story. The first major argument that someone would have here is, how would Saitama possibly not remember fighting the Mad Cyborg? It seems like such a unique type of monster that there's no way that Saitama would forget it. Well, Saitama himself in this chapter points out that there is a good chance that he would forget fighting the Mad Cyborg if he did, because he doesn't remember the vast majority of the monsters he's defeated. I mean, just think about it. If you talk to Saitama about Carnage Kabuto or Boros' commanders, or that giant titan-sized monster at the beginning of the anime, there's a good chance that Saitama wouldn't have any freaking clue about who you were talking about, and you wouldn't think twice about it because that's just how Saitama is. Well, although the Mad Cyborg might be much more powerful than all these monsters, to Saitama it would probably still be nothing. So right there, that opens the window to this being possible. The other thing we have to consider is the fact that the Mad Cyborg was first created 4 years ago from the current timeline, and Saitama didn't start his training to becoming the strongest until 3 years before the current timeline. So that means that the Mad Cyborg destroyed Genos' town a whole year before Saitama even started his training. So taking into account the time that it took for Saitama to remove his limiter and become strong enough to even be able to defeat the Mad Cyborg, we're looking at about a 2 or 3 year timetable from the day that the Mad Cyborg was last seen and when Saitama would have been able to beat it in a one-on-one. So that being considered, let's start the timeline here. 4 years ago, the Mad Cyborg is first created and goes on a rampage and destroys multiple towns including Genos. After this point, the Mad Cyborg is never heard from again. This raises the question, well, what happened to it then? Well, Genos describes the Mad Cyborg as this like rampaging machine. Well, every cyborg that we've seen in the story, including Genos and Drive Knight and others, seems to be highly intelligent, and I highly doubt that the Mad Cyborg would be any different. It is possible that we're looking at a Mad Genius scenario where the Mad Cyborg is very evil and very destructive, but in a calculated way. It's doing it with a purpose, and every move it makes is methodical. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been able to lay low for so long. The Mad Cyborg probably realized that it needed to lay low for a while and create this base of operations for it to lay dormant in and possibly recuperate all of its power from destroying all of those towns, or possibly some other sinister reason. Well, of course, the best way to evade detection is staying away from heavy populated areas like all of the cities from A to Z, so there's a good chance that the Mad Cyborg set up a base of operations somewhere in the middle of nowhere, somewhere deep in the woods or something. Think of the House of Evolution that Dr. Genus created, where it's this super high-tech lab sitting in the middle of nowhere hiding in plain sight. So after the Mad Cyborg creates this laboratory or base, it then goes dormant. Well, a year later, Saitama starts his journey to becoming the strongest, and a few years after that, he ends up removing his limiter and becomes strong enough to defeat insanely powerful monsters. We also got to consider that Saitama, fresh off of removing his limiter, is still probably excited about the prospect of fighting new opponents. It isn't until Saitama's overpowered for a while that he starts to get like really lethargic and really detached from humanity and his own emotions. So we kind of have to put ourselves in a mind frame of a Saitama that's actively looking for more and more worthy adversaries and trying to find them wherever he can. Well, as I just said earlier, the Mad Cyborg would more than likely be hidden somewhere in the woods or somewhere in the middle of nowhere. So what business would Saitama have being out there in the first place? After all, 99% of the time that we see Saitama, he's in his apartment or he's within one of the cities, going to the grocery store or fighting monsters, whatever. Well, we actually see see in one of the One Punch Man bonus chapters that Saitama saves this kid from this snowman monster and then goes on to fight this insanely huge snowman monster that's like the size of a mountain, and it looks like he's in the middle of nowhere. Also, when Saitama's all down on himself when he realizes that nobody knows who he is, even though he's defeated all these crazy strong monsters, it definitely seems like Saitama has really been through it in defeating some ultra powerful monsters, and not all of them could have possibly been within city limits, seeing as how most of the cities would have been probably destroyed if this was the case. So this all goes to say that there is a good chance that Saitama would routinely be scouting these middle of nowhere areas looking for the next powerful monster. Well, one day as he's doing this, he stumbles across the base that the Mad Cyborg created, and seeing as how the Mad Cyborg is now laying dormant, it is possible that the Mad Cyborg created defense robots and scouting robots in order to retrieve resources to help replenish its power. Well, Saitama might have stumbled across one of these scouting robots and followed it to the base, where he gets curious and decides to try and walk in. The Mad Cyborg would undoubtedly have some massive, insanely powerful defense robots protecting it, but much like Dr. Bofoi's defense robots from the Hero Association, Saitama would take them out no problem and very quickly. This would reactivate the Mad Cyborg and make it realize that there's somebody trespassing in his hidden base and go to eliminate the target himself. Well, there's no suspense here because we all know that Saitama would one-shot it and probably be very underwhelmed with the Mad Cyborg's power and just end up making his way back to Z City in time for the next deal at the supermarket. Well, the events of the manga go on as they do. Saitama meets Genos a year or two later, he becomes his disciple, they go through all the major arcs of the story, and it's finally time for Genos to come face to face with the Mad Cyborg. Well, once Genos finally locates the base that the Mad Cyborg has been hiding this entire time, he stumbles across a complete mess. Like, there's all these destroyed robots everywhere, and he notes that there's these humanoid cyborg parts just sprawled out all over the ground. That seems like they haven't been touched in a while. After a while of Genos pondering what the hell's going on, Saitama thinks to go check up on Genos and provide backup if he needs it or something, and as he's approaching the Mad Cyborg's hidden base, he starts to think to himself like, wait, why does this stuff all look kind of familiar? And it's not until he actually reaches Genos that he realizes, wait, I've been here before and I destroyed some super powerful cyborg like a year ago. And this is when it all hits Genos and he realizes that Saitama really did defeat the Mad Cyborg, and Genos has been working towards this unattainable goal this entire time. But this is when his mentor Saitama or somebody else would kind of come in and make Genos realize the error of his ways, that in pursuit of revenge against this Mad Cyborg, he altered his body, became less and less human, and all the rage and need for revenge within him slowly turned him into a Mad Cyborg himself. Now, the reason why I see this as being like the character arc that one would go with if he decides to go with this storyline is for two reasons. One, because he might make this a similar story arc to Dimple from Mob Psycho, one of his other works, where, you know, I'm not going to spoil anything here, but Dimple has his grand goal of being a god, but by the end of the story he realizes that even if he obtained all of this power that he wanted, all he really wanted in the end was to be accepted and to have friends. You know, that super cheesy classic shonen character arc, right? He also has his character arc for a lot of the other characters in the same series, so it's very possible that one likes to play on the whole, you know, what you wanted wasn't what you really wanted trope with the storytelling at times, which isn't a bad thing, it just is what it is. Well, aside from this, the seeds for this character arc for Genos have already actually been planted in the same chapter that all this stuff is being discussed, because what also happens in chapter 186 is that Genos challenges Saitama to a rematch from the first fight they had way back in season 1 of the anime, where the first fight ends with Saitama throwing a death punch to Genos, and the force from that punch creates this enormous dust cloud behind him. Well, in the rematch a very similar thing happens, but it's actually Genos who throws the punch that creates this massive dust cloud. They're drawn very similarly, and I don't think this was an accident. I think this was intentional in showing just how far Genos has come. But if you guys remember, in that first fight, Genos thinks to himself that there's no way he could ever possibly see himself becoming that powerful and creating this massive impact just from the force of a punch, and here he is in the rematch actually doing it. So you would assume that Genos would be proud of himself for coming this far, but it's actually quite the opposite for him. He's kind of having this existential crisis where he feels like he's never strong enough, and he has this deep feeling of stagnation where he feels like he'll never reach the power necessary to defeat the Mad Cyborg, essentially setting up that Genos is never living in the moment and appreciating what's going on right now. He's completely blinded by revenge and always wanting more. Well, this would bring things full circle, fast forwarding to the moment that Genos realizes that the Mad Cyborg has been dead this entire time, and his character arc would be him realizing all these toxic tendencies that he has and kind of leaving it all behind him. This would lead to Genos now wanting to become strong for himself and not for some vengeful goal, therefore rounding out the Genos and Mad Cyborg storyline. Now, as I said at the top of this video, I'm not here arguing that this this is a direction that one should go with the storyline. On the contrary, this would be very anticlimactic for me, like I'm sure it would be for many of you. I definitely want to see that shining moment where Genos finally comes face to face with the Mad Cyborg and completely demolishes it, and finally giving Genos a W, since all he does right now is take L's and destroy his body. That would be very satisfying for me to see. But what do you guys think about this alternate possibility? Would you hate it? Would you not mind it? Let me know in the comments below. I think this was a pretty fun topic to kind of discuss here, so I definitely want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. That does it for this one though, guys. Have an absolutely wonderful night, and I'll see you guys in the next one.